Recently at Flamecon 2023, which apparently happened in August, I don't think I need to explain what Flamecon is. It's a Comic-Con for the LGBTQ community. But there was a panel on there talking about mainstream comic books and the way some of these creators are infiltrating mainstream comic books to queer them up. And I thought it was not surprising, but somewhat interesting, because I found 3 really good examples of why I think a lot of the push for LGBTQ representation in mainstream comic books, i.e. DC and Marvel comics mostly, hasn't been very successful at this point. Recently, I was talking to Doc on a video and I was explaining, in my point of view, a comic book doesn't have to be written specifically for me or for me to enjoy it for it to be successful. The numbers speak volumes. If people enjoy the comic book and people show up at their comic book shop and they buy the comic book and they read it and they talk about it, then it's a successful comic book. It turns out people come to Marvel Comics and DC Comics for specifically superhero fare. Now, within superhero fare, you're admittedly going to have some slice of life stuff. You're going to have some coming of age stuff. Of course, if you're a younger superhero, you're even going to have some relationship drama. But for the most part, when fans read superhero comic books, they're expecting a vast majority of the story to be superhero related. The big problem that came in, and really it started with Marvel, but now it's moved over to DC and it's kind of taken over both of their publishers, whether they like to admit it or not, is they went out there and they said, well, we need more representation in comic books. We need more LGBTQ representation in our comic books. We don't have enough gay and trans heroes, so they went out and hired a bunch of slice of life, coming of age, YA graphic novel, LGBTQ writers that had been marginally successful in the graphic novel market. And they said, you know what? Hell, they're qualified to write Batman. They're qualified to write Superman. They're qualified to write any of our characters because they're going to actually bring in authentic LGBTQ representation to our superhero universe. And of course, they started out with original characters, and that didn't work because most of these writers, they define the character down to the sole essence of the character is their sexuality. It's their gender identity. It's something like that. And it's no longer their core values and principles that drive them to be superheroes. So we get the lowest common denominator, most base level version of a character that, of course, only can be one representation of the LGBTQ community. You can't have any representation that isn't approved by the board, because apparently there are no gay men out there that dress and act like I do, even though I've known several of them. But you can only be kind of flamboyant. You can only be mincing. You have to fall in love immediately anytime you run into another character of the same sex, because apparently the approved version of LGBTQ people in mainstream entertainment is they have to be vapid and absolutely sex crazed or whatever. And it turns out a lot of superhero fans aren't a fan of that, and it's been very hurtful. Now, it's okay to do something once and be hurtful, and maybe you do it twice and you're like, okay, it still didn't work. We still didn't quite get it right this time. But once you do the exact same thing over and over and over again for years upon years, which has now happened at DC and Marvel Comics, it becomes exceptionally hurtful. Because once they figure out that you can't just introduce a new hero that's only based on their sexuality, and people just they repel against it. I don't want to read that. You actually have to take an established hero. You need to do a sexuality change because that hero's already over. People already like that hero. That hero's already got an established fan base. And now we get them too, right? They come with the character. It turns out that's not true. What you actually end up doing is long-term harm to characters that have been established for 30, 40, 50 years, because these things come out of nowhere and it's almost like a brand new character. And everything you read prior to this doesn't matter or doesn't exist anymore. And it certainly doesn't matter to the writers. And that's a lot about what's going on here. And for some reason, Marvel and DC just cannot get their heads around this, get a handle on it, that it's okay for there to be a place for LGBTQ coming of age gay romance stories in comic books that isn't DC and Marvel. It's okay for there to be trans slice of life comic books on the bookshelf that don't say DC or Marvel, because they're more niche audiences, and it turns out they're not as accessible to mainstream. Just throwing a superhero identity on a trans character doesn't make them mainstream. Just saying that there's a Superman out there that's gay doesn't make it mainstream. It turns out you have to put a lot more work into it to establish the character and have people buy into it. Now, let's talk about this panel. I probably talked for too long, but let's get to the details and what I want to talk about here. Some of the top names in comics gathered on stage in a packed room at Flamecon this year for a panel entitled, "But Make It Queer, Turning Mainstream Universes Gay from Gotham to Galaxies Far, Far Away." The panel's guests included writer Terry Bloss, cover artist Sway, writer Alyssa Wong, and writer, critic, podcaster Charlie Jane Anders. Perhaps surprisingly, a common thread throughout the panel was that despite the challenges presented by homophobia and transphobia, they reported little pushback in their efforts to queer, beloved franchises, many of which existed for decades with little to no authentic queer or trans representation. Seriously, does anyone out there watching the video right now that has seen what's happened, not just with comic books over the past 5 or 6 years, but just mainstream entertainment, find it surprising that despite all the overwhelming homophobia and transphobia out there, that nobody at DC or Marvel gives them any pushback once they want to start incorporating LGBTQ slice of life and coming of age stories into their superhero comic books, or start doing sexuality reveals? No, that's not surprising. That's the agenda. We've all seen it for years now. It used to be a little bit more covert when you had maybe better writing to where they could actually hide the true intentions of what they were trying to do. But this new crop of writers are completely overt about it. And there's no surprise about that. I don't know. It's 2023. Do people really still get upset? Like, oh my goodness, you're gay? We can't be friends no more. Oh my goodness, you're gay? Don't share that soda with me. Oh my goodness, you're trans now? We can't have a plate of spaghetti for dinner anymore. Nobody really feels that way. And I'm not here. Nobody's here going, oh my goodness, I'm so homophobic and transphobic. You could never have a gay hero in DC Comics or a trans hero in Marvel. Of course that's not true. We've had gay and trans characters in mainstream comics for over 30 years now. This stuff isn't breaking news. It's been there all along, except there was better writers at the time. I'm just saying, if you call it a Superman comic, he needs to be fucking Superman. I don't care about his boyfriend. If you want to incorporate that stuff, great. But you better have an amazing A story, i.e. the main event, him defeating a supervillain. And all that stuff for a lot of these writers has fallen to the wayside. They don't even care how, if, or when the hero even saves the day, even though that's the main appeal of superhero comic books. It's good versus evil. It's the same reason people are drawn to Hercules. It's the same reason people are drawn to Hannibal Barca. It's the same reason people are drawn to Harold Hardrada or whatever, because you have these modern myths and these great vehicles for telling stories that have valuable lifelong lessons. I don't need to be indoctrinated into LGBTQ community through my entertainment. In fact, I don't want that. And that's one of the main reasons a lot of people have just walked away from comic books. You just never know anymore. And that is an enormous folly on DC and Marvel Comics, that they're not hiring better editors, specifically group editors, that say, you know what? I understand what you want to do with this character, but you're going to have to write it better. Or, oh, you want to do a sexuality swap on a character that's existed for 30 years and has had a girlfriend for 25 of them? Yeah, that's not really going to make sense. You're going to have to do something new, but you're also going to have to do it well, because if you don't write it well, and if there's no reason for that character to exist in the story, I'm not going to allow it. But DC and Marvel just allow their pages to be flooded with mediocre writing just so they can say, we have more LGBTQ representation, which in the end doesn't really help anybody, because it's the same stereotypical lowest common denominator bullshit that we've been getting from entertainment when it comes to gay people for like 25 years now. There's nothing new or original about it. It's boring, it's played out, and it doesn't work in superhero comics. Rick and Morty writer Terry Bloss stated, I just don't ask. I think there are like 3 Death Becomes Her jokes in my Steven Universe run. And the team didn't say anything, so it got through. I would hope that if an editor were to approach me about writing something, they would know that I'm not going to write something that doesn't feel right to me. For something like Reptile, it's important for me to include queer and Mexican-American representation in all my work. And right there, you can kind of see the narcissism of the writer themselves. If the story isn't about me and what I represent and what I stand for, then I can't write the story. If you want to be an impediment between me and only talking about things that I think are important, you better not hire me, because the only thing important in the equation is how I feel. It's not about the customer. It's not about the fans. It's not about the reading experience. It's not about somebody opening their comic book and feeling like they got their money's worth. It's only important if Terry Bloss and his message gets across to you, and it can't be subtle, it can't be a little understated, it has to be so over the top, it has to hit you on the head and knock you out, because you know exactly what he's trying to do. He needs to indoctrinate you and everybody else into everything that's important to him about himself. And that is one of the real failings of the last 5 or 6 years of mainstream comic books. And I'm not claiming that Rick and Morty as a comic book is mainstream, but certainly the property Rick and Morty is pretty mainstream. People know what that is. A lot of people go to the comic books because I don't know why. They like that sense of humor. It certainly ruined a lot of movie franchises. It certainly ruined a lot of comic books hiring Rick and Morty writers because you get really stupid, lowest common denominator humor that doesn't really do anything. It doesn't make you think. But right there, Terry Bloss tells you exactly how important the reader or customer is in the equation, or even the publisher at that fact, after what he said there. They are not important to Terry Bloss and a lot of these other writers, and I think it comes through loud and clear. It is not about whether or not you like the character. It is not about whether you want to see a superhero story. If I write the story, you're only going to get my point of view, and we're only going to shove down things that are important to me. And the narcissism that's really overtaken comic books and is just so prevalent, it's wall to wall in the comic books themselves. And you come away saying, this comic book feels like it was written for no one. And I guess in that respect, you're wrong. It was written for somebody, the fucking writer himself, even though that's only one customer or potential customer. I imagine they get comps on that kind of stuff. And it's just an enormous failing on the part of the publishers themselves, not to regulate, not to go out there and hire the very best writers that know the craft and want to tell the best stories with their characters in their universe. Most of these writers come to these projects with me in mind. Well, not me, but them in mind. You get what I'm saying? And that has been a huge problem in comic books. This last one I thought was really interesting. A great deal of praise was lavished upon Alyssa Wong's Deadpool run, which marks the first time a queer writer has written the titular pansexual antihero. Describing previous runs as having a sort of Bugs Bunny queerness, Charlie Jane Anders proclaimed that she couldn't believe how queer the run has been so far. They're getting away with things I didn't know it was possible to get away with. And I know you guys will all be really surprised to know that Alyssa Wong's Daredevil run has not been successful. In fact, 3 issues in a row have basically sat right above 100 or outside of the top 100. Basically, it's a dead title walking and has been for months upon months now because she decided she needed to have the most queer Deadpool run of all times. Kind of a weird goal in mind, if you ask me. But obviously, the people aren't reading it because they don't really care. Actually, no one cares about Alyssa Wong's comic books. Everything she writes now absolutely dies. And you know what's weird about Alyssa Wong? I can tell you this. Alyssa Wong can't actually write a comic book. Deadpool #1, actually pretty darn good. The teaser for Spirit World, that was supposed to get you interested in that new title, actually pretty decent. I remember telling Doc, hey, this Spirit World thing actually reads pretty good. It's something I would be interested in if it wasn't written by Alyssa Wong and I didn't know exactly where it was going. The Deadpool run, Doc and I reviewed it. He even recommended the damn thing. And at the end, I said, I'm not going to read this anymore because I've actually read Alyssa Wong and I know exactly where this is going. Because in spite of actually having some talent there and ability to actually tell a story every once in a while, it always has to be about Alyssa Wong. But I thought the Charlie Jane Anders quote was really interesting. They're getting away with things I didn't know it was possible to get away with. That tells me loud and clear that these writers, these creators, know they shouldn't be pushing the envelope quite so far, that it's actually to the harm or detriment to the publishers themselves, to Marvel and DC, to go as far as queering up their characters and universe and stories to this degree, and they're happy to get away with it. When you get away with something, that means you know you did something that was wrong, and you hoped that you didn't get caught. Now, we all know that Marvel and DC Comics are on board for this, and I imagine a lot of the writers at this point understand that DC and Marvel Comics are their allies in queering up comic books. But even the writers, knowing that, are still surprised just how hurtful Marvel and DC are allowing them to be with their characters and universes. They spell it out for you right there on the panel. Marvel and DC Comics are doing it to themselves because there's no quality control over the writers, over the stories, over the continuity. There's no quality control among any of it because they have the least incompetent editors in the world. They have the most absentee leadership in the world, and they just allow a bunch of creators to come in with their own personal agendas, run amok, and then get away with things that they wouldn't do to their own properties. Charlie Jane Anders would never write something so bad as Lethal Legion. That comic book is absolutely unreadable. At least I can say for Alyssa Wong, she's written 2 comic books that weren't absolute trash. You can't say Charlie Jane Anders has ever written a comic book that was almost competent. And they're sitting there getting away with things that they know they shouldn't even be doing because it's hurtful to the mainstream comic book industry, which in America is heavily reliant on superhero universes, superhero characters. The superhero portion pushed to the wayside. It's all about agendas. It's all about LGBTQ representation coming to the forefront. And in most cases, when you're dealing with these writers, overtaking everything about the character, story, universe, and everything. It's absolutely insane what these people have been allowed to do, the amount of harm these creators have been allowed to inflict upon DC and Marvel Comics, but they're willing accomplices. They just go with it. The writers can't even believe that DC and Marvel allow them to do this anymore. Of course, this isn't completely new. In fact, there was an interview a couple of years ago with Alyssa Wong, and she was bragging about she was going to queer up Daredevil. She was so proud that she had queered up Star Wars. It's like the biggest accomplishment in her entire life. Of course, Dr. Aphra doesn't sell at all because it's an Alyssa Wong comic book, and everybody knows exactly what they're going to get. I broke it all down right here. Very interesting interview, very interesting insights from Alyssa Wong. It's not covert at all. It's absolutely over. There's also a link in the video description.